All right, what's up, guys? So my last video on a sort of meta approach to studying and improvement, a lot of people enjoyed it, but I did get a good amount of feedback saying that it was a little vague and unclear about how to build structure, what are good questions, how do we find good answers, and so I am back to answer all of that for you. My name is Alderman. Let's dive in. So I'm going to lay out what I think is the most fundamental structured approach to poker. It's something that I think everyone should implement into the way that they view and approach the game. Many new players skip this because there's so many complex ideas out there around theory, blockers, blah, 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 this kind of stuff. And many advanced players also actually don't use this as the fundamental basis for their thought process in game. And usually where I see big blunders happen by better players, it's because they have failed to just think in the simplest way about the spot that they're in. So this structure is that we basically only have three spots in poker. We are either value betting, bluff catching, or bluffing. It's worth saying there are very many valid criticisms to viewing spots in such simplistic terms, but again, these are the fundamental concepts with which we can use to view the game that will really help us branch out and explore more complicated, nuanced areas of the game once we understand these three. And I'm actually going to explain how we might do that later in the video. So I need to define these because one of the things that I often run into is when I ask people what they're doing, they'll give an answer that is one of these, but they really don't understand what each of these things are and what dictates them being good. The most misunderstood of these is value betting. Often when I ask people what's the worst hand they think they can value bet here, they don't even really know what I'm asking. And then I usually ask, what is a value bet? Let me ask you, what is a value bet? Think for a moment and come up with the best answer you can. The most common answer I get is, well, we're betting to get called. And this is true, but my follow-up question would be, how often do we need to be winning when we get called for it to be a value bet? And surprisingly, even from fairly advanced players, I will still hear an answer around something like 80%. That if I get called and I win 80% of the time, I made a good value bet. But if we're just trying to win a portion of the pot that goes in at the moment of showdown, we only need to win 51% of the time, or anything more than 50% of the time. As long as we're winning more than 50% of the time, we're winning more of the pot than we're losing. And this is unintuitive for a lot of people. Our worst value bet will win the pot greater than 50% of the time when called. Okay, let's go to the next. Bluff catching. Bluff catching is more obvious, right? We're calling to win against the times when they have a bluff. And we expect to lose against the times that they have value. One of the most unintuitive facts, though, is we just need to win at a higher percent than the pot odds we're being given. So if someone bets the pot, we're getting 2-1. We only need to win 33% of the time. This means, on average, when we're bluff catching, we should be losing. There's no size on earth someone can bet for which you should win most of the time when you bluff catch. When I look at people's databases, a common mistake that I see is people who think they're crushing bluff catching is because they're winning often, but that means you're actually not calling enough. How it should feel often to bluff catch and do it well should be to lose. And that's a very unintuitive fact of bluff catching. Okay. The third area, bluffing. Same as bluff catching, but the inverse. All we need to do is produce the folds of the pot odds we're being given. So if I bet the pot, all I need to do is believe that they're going to fold greater than 50% of the time because I'm getting 1-1. Every time they fold, I win the pot and I'm risking the size of the pot to do that. The less I bet, the less I need them to fold. If I bet a quarter of the pot, I'm getting like 5-1. They can almost always call and I can be winning. So these are three very simple concepts that most people never consider when they're making a decision. When you listen to people's thought process, the amount of times you hear things like blockers or I'm value betting this hand or this is good for my range or all kinds of ideas that have nothing to do with the raw facts of what makes decisions profitable. And the truth is, you're either value betting, bluffing, or bluff catching. There are just raw mathematical facts that make one of those decisions to be profitable. Now, in my last video, I talked about how structure is useful because it allows us to ask useful questions. Well, what would some of these questions be given these concepts? Let's start with value betting because I think the question here is the most useful. So we just ask, what is the 50th percentile hand that's calling me? This is an incredibly useful question to be asking yourself if you're considering value betting. Don't think about things like protection or this is good for my range or anything like that. Just think, I'm thinking about betting this size. When I bet, they're going to call me with what hands? Do I beat half of those? Yeah? Bet. No? Check. And things like protection and equity and all other things can come into this, but they get layered on top of this. if you're not thinking this to start, you're not going to do a good job at integrating ideas like protection and equity and all the other complicated, nuanced ideas that can be useful in navigating this. So next, bluff catching. What's a useful question to ask here? Well, it's pretty simple. Are they bluffing enough? And the reason this is a useful question is because one of the most common things I see people miss in showdowns is people who check back too strong of hands, people who don't go for value thin enough. That's a really important information at showdowns, because what does that mean when they're betting? It's so much easier for them to be bluffing. The people you see who do not bet thin enough for value, when they bet, the amount of value combos they have, although they may be stronger, are far fewer. Whereas when they decide to bluff, their ratio of bluff to value bets get way out of whack. I see people all the time when people place bets representing very strong hands, that the strength of the hand scares them away from calling, because it looks ridiculous to call with bottom pair when a person has top set. But the truth is, in spots where people are only value betting strong hands, the odds that they're bluffing go way up. That brings us to bluffing. What's a good question for us to ask when bluffing? Simple. Do they fold enough? And this is another spot where I see people conceptually focus on the wrong kinds of hands when it comes to bluffing. On average, I see people fixate on hands that are way too strong. Like, is bluffing here good? Well, I don't think they fold top pair. And it's like, well, they should never be folding top pair. If they fold top pair here, you're printing money with bluffing. If there's even a chance of them folding top pair in some spots, that you should never not fire a bluff. Well, what people miss is all the air hands people can have. A good example of this is in a 3-bet pot. Let's say you get 3-bet, I don't know, in a tournament, 50 big blinds deep, and the flop is 4-4-2. And then you check and they lead out for range. Your opponent has nothing. They have air all the time. And it feels ridiculous to check raise in a spot where someone can have aces. But the other thing that they have is king 10 suited, all kinds of nonsense that they have to call that probably just folds. And again, this is a spot where people feel ridiculous bluffing, because when they get called, they get shown an obviously strong hand. But that's not what we're after. We're after the hands that are unintuitive and the hands that are going to fold. So let me recap what we've covered. We've covered a simple structural way of approaching the game, simple questions to be asking ourselves. Now let's talk about getting answers, because most of the people were thinking about getting answers in terms of going to solvers. But the answers you get are in the environments you play. And when you ask these questions in the environments you play, what happens? You see showdowns, and showdowns give you knowledge. So for example, let's go through each of these one by one. Let's say we're value betting and we say, I think I beat the 50th percentile hand that calls me, and I bet. And then we get snap called by a hand that is way weaker than we thought. What does that tell us? This person, we can value bet way thinner. We were way off when thinking about the 50th percentile hand that calls us. Or the opposite can happen. We bet and we get tank called by a hand way stronger than we thought would be tank calling. This tells us we probably went way too thin for value. No big deal. We just adjust. And the interesting thing is when you frame this in this way, you get information to inform all the other hands you might be playing. So for example, in the spot where someone tank calls, you know this is probably a spot I can bluff a lot. Similarly, if I go to bluff somebody and I expect they're going to fold all these hands, and way worse a hand calls than I think is going to call, what does that tell me? I can go really thin in this spot for value. And in this way, we play as to mine information. We do not play to make good decisions. And this is a process-centered approach. We create a structure, we give ourselves questions, and we get answers to those questions, and we iterate again and again and again. So a final point about how this can branch into the future and improve play. You start in this simple way, the structure that I've laid out, and then you get into a spot where you're not sure if you should value bet or not. And you have this intuition, like, man, value betting here seems a little too thin based on 50%. But I also feel like I'm getting a lot of hands with equity to fold. And I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle. Well, this is when protection layers in. And then we can have a new question around how many hands do I think I need to be getting to fold with how much equity to make this value bet good? This is what solvers are good for. They have that kind of quantitative information available to you to help inform your intuition about how thin you can value bet when hands with a lot of equity are folding. Or similarly, you can get into a spot where it's like, I don't think I'm getting the folds that I need, but I feel like I also have a lot of equity against what calls me. Again, this is where we get to go into a solver and look. Or I think I beat 50% of what calls me, but I feel like I get check raised here very often. How often does that need to be happen for me not to be able to bet call here? These are more advanced, more complicated questions, and they will be, and when you ask them starting from the right basis, they will work themselves very naturally and intuitively into your game. And before you know it, you'll find yourself playing it in a far more complex and nuanced way. I want to finish with what I think is the most valuable piece of information, and this will not feel most valuable to many people. But there's a reason I didn't give examples of structures and questions and answers in my first video. And the reason is the structures and questions and answers that you need are unique to you. You need to find the structure that feels appropriate and good and useful for you. You need to find the questions that are answers to the things that you care about. I gave you what I think is a really good starting point, but I really encourage all of you to make this game your own. Take it upon yourself to explore and ask questions and investigate and be curious, and to throw out concerns about playing this game in a way that anyone else thinks is good. I hope this was useful. My name's Jared Alderman. Until next time.